Hey everybody, it's Meteor Geyser here, back again for part 2 of the Can You Beat Fire Emblem, The Binding Blade, with only Roy and his Harem challenge that I've been doing. Thank you so much to everyone who has watched part 1, and if you haven't watched part 1 of this, it would make no sense to watch part 2, so I'll leave a link in the description to go ahead and check that out. Now, if you're interested in seeing any more of this stuff, I'll do some shameless self-promotion right here. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It would be greatly appreciated. It gives me a little bit more encouragement to keep up with these highly edited videos. I've got more plans in the future for you guys. Part 2 will start right where we left off at chapter 16X. Now, this will be a little bit shorter than the first part, so I don't want to drag this on too much longer. So I hope you enjoy part 2. Chapter 16X is one of those annoying chapters yet again, as there are units with Berserk tomes and Silence tomes. To be honest, I think the Berserk tome was the biggest pain in the ass. The reason for that being was Echidna got berserked and was constantly chasing after my units, especially Lilina. Thankfully though, I was able to use Lilina to bait Echidna into enemy units. She surprisingly did not die. And I used Lilina to kill the boss Windham. With that, we're able to move on to chapter 17. At the end of chapter 16X, we're able to pick up Aurelia, a legendary light magic spell. Now, chapter 17 is a huge map with an arena. The main thing to mention here is this is actually chapter 17A. There are two routes that you can take through the game, the Ilia route or the Sakai route. You take the Ilia route if the experience points gained by Shanna and Thea, or Tate, were more than that of Sue and Shin. Now, our Shanna, I made sure to keep our Shanna higher level than our Sue, just so I could get this path, because there are more female units in this path than there are in the Sakai route. What I do during this map is counterintuitive. I actually send Shanna and Milady to deal with the ballista in the middle, realizing that their hit rate is not very high, and I'm able to avoid most of the attacks, and even if the ballista attack, I'm still able to survive and use a physic to heal them up. I take care of the ballista, and we're able to slowly move through the chapter. Now, the reason I mentioned an arena earlier is because this is the second instance where I quote-unquote abuse the arena. I have Sophia, Lauren, and Ellen over at the arena in order to get Sophia up to level 15, which is close enough in my eyes for a promotion, so she can be on par with the rest of the team. I do a little bit more shopping, and Echidna is able to defeat the boss Accardo with a lucky crit from a killing edge. Next up, we move on to chapter 18A. This is the first instance of our snow section of the game. There's a lot of forest tiles, so moving through this chapter is a bit of a slog, and there's a bunch of ballista. As the chapter starts, I immediately send Milady and Shanna to the village on the right. I move all my other units up north to the bridge up top. Again, this chapter was not very difficult, just very long and annoying. Towards the end of the chapter, the river actually gets frozen over, so I'm able to send a non-flying unit to the village in the north because I can cross the river now. This also makes traversing the rest of the map easier, because I'm able to not funnel everyone into a bridge and I can just cross wherever I want. There's a bunch of brigands that keep spawning from the north, but I'm able to pick them off pretty easily. I'm able to make my way over to the boss Martel, who I take out with Sue. We move on to chapter 19A, which looks scary and it feels scary, but it's actually a very simple map. The reason I say it looks scary is because everyone has to funnel into one little area between the mountains, and it's fog of war, so you can't see what's in front of you. There are also ballistas scattered throughout the map that we have to deal with, some of them having insane range. However, we use the same strategy we've always used, and I send Milady and Shanna throughout the map to deal with the ballista. There's a lot of druids in this chapter who have silent staffs, so we have to be able to deal with them. The other thing to mention is we get access at the beginning of the chapter to Nime, a level 18 druid who comes with a physic and an eclipse tome. Eclipse being a long range dark magic tome. Thankfully though, the chapter's really not too bad, and we're able to defeat the boss Sigune with Milady. Chapter 21A is the last chapter in the Ilia route. It features more treasure chests, so we need to bring Kath along for this chapter. It also features our last unit, Juno, who's one of the 3 Pegasus riders. As per most of the other chapters by this point, there are a few ballistas set up in spots that we can't get to. My strategy for this map was to funnel everyone into the left room, except for 2 units, those being Milady and Shauna. Milady and Shauna dealt with the ballista on the right side of the map. After doing that, I left Milady there and quickly brought Shauna over towards Juno because Shauna is needed to recruit Juno. After that, the civilians will make a beeline for the exit. I'm able to take out one of the ballistas using a longbow on Sue, but besides that, I have to wait for the southern ballista to have used all of its shots. It focused mainly on Cecilia, who was able to avoid most of the hits, and when I got hit, I just healed Cecilia back up. The boss of this chapter, Roarts, was taken out with Lilina yet again. Damn, she really is the carry for this playthrough. With that, we're able to move on to the next Gaiden chapter, Chapter 20AX. In order to unlock this chapter, you need to have completed the last chapter within 25 turns, and Juno and Zealot have to both been recruited. So that's why I mentioned early on, back in Chapter 7, you need to recruit Zealot. Now, this Gaiden chapter is extremely interesting. All of your units are split up and have to destroy cracks in the wall in order to get closer to the boss room. The most annoying thing about this chapter is there's a druid with a sleep staff and a druid with a berserk staff. The berserk staff user got insanely lucky and got all 3 hits, one on Echidna, one on Clarine, and one on Cecilia. For avoiding Echidna trying to kill me, I was able to position Sue and Neem out of her way. Clarine was more focused on dealing damage to the enemies, so that wasn't a problem. The biggest issue, however, was Cecilia, because of her AI targeting would go for Roy. Roy at this point is not very powerful. Roy is more of a character that you need to just carry to the throne room and avoid having any sort of battles. I try and hide Roy from Cecilia, but it doesn't work out very well. She is able to attack Roy, but thankfully I get extremely lucky and one of her 2 attacks misses. That means I'm able to heal up Roy back to full health and Cecilia no longer has Berserk. After that, the rest of the chapter becomes a breeze and I'm able to converge all my units onto the boss room. Everyone worked on taking down the boss Tick, but Sue was able to get in the finishing blow, and we seize the throne. At the end of chapter 20AX, we are able to get the legendary weapon, Maltet, a lance. We move on to chapter 21, which is easily the longest chapter in the game. Chapter 21 is very deceiving. The reason I say this is because when you first start the map, it doesn't look like there's a terrible amount of units. However, once you pass certain points in the map, there'll be more and more reinforcements, a lot of these being Wyvern Knights and Wyvern Lords. Now, my general strategy for this chapter was I moved everyone to the right, going past the northwest mountain range. Once we got there, I split off my units a bit, let Shauna and Milady go wild. Reinforcements came from the south and from the lower right. I let Sue and Lilina deal with the southern reinforcements near the village. I left Milady and Shauna to deal with the right reinforcements. I've regrouped everyone and moved southwards to just above the temple where the boss is. Now this is sort of where my plan goes awry. The reason I say this is because more and more reinforcements keep coming from now what is north of us. At least 4 wyverns a turn are spawning. So in order to deal with them, I need to have Shauna, Milady, and Sue all up north. That's my biggest problem with this playthrough so far, is I've relied so much on certain units that the rest of my army is very average. The other thing I forgot to mention is this chapter you're able to bring 18 units. And I make the foolish mistake of bringing every single unit because it takes a while for all of my units to sort of move. You also get Yoder at the beginning of this chapter, who you definitely want to keep alive or trade his items away because he has some very powerful staffs. Chapter 21 also has a secret shop, so if you want to buy any remaining items, you have to go to the slot in between the mountains, right where Milady went. Now the secret shop is really good if you have any spare money. You can buy any promotional item you need, or any stat boosting item you need, literally every single one in the game. Now getting back on track, to right above the temple, I planned on moving all of my units to the right side of the temple. Then I had Lilina stay to the left to protect any units from the wyverns that were spawning in the south. Thankfully this strategy worked, it just took a very long time to clean up all of the wyverns that were spawning constantly. We moved down to the boss, Murdoch, who gets one shot by Lilina with a crit thunder. Moving on to the next chapter, which is chapter 21X, you're able to get to this chapter if you clear chapter 21 within 30 turns, and both Milady and Zeiss have been recruited. That's why I said before that you want to recruit Zeiss with Milady. That's why we went through that pain in chapter 16. Now, chapter 21X is a Fog of War chapter. There are two paths that you can take. You can either take the right or the left path. In our situation, I go right. This map does have a decent amount of enemies, but since we're only going the right path, we can avoid the left path's enemies. There are several treasure chests on this map, but a lot of them are just mimics. What I mean by that is if you open them, there's a chance that you'd either get an elixir or a mana key will spawn. Me, personally, I didn't really care to go for the elixirs, so I didn't even bring Kath along in this chapter, considering you were only allowed 10 units. There was such a small amount of units that I could bring, considering I was forced into 7 of my units. I found no room to bring Kath along, and I decided to not bother with the elixirs. This chapter was more of a slog if anything, because it was quite long and it took a while for all of our units to get to the point they needed to be, which was the boss room, but ultimately the map was not that difficult. The only thing to really mention is there are a few druids with Fenrir, which is a very powerful tome. Also, this map had a few traps, so be wary for those, but they won't do any more damage than 10. Something very unfortunate happened in this chapter. Just as I was about to defeat the boss, Paris, I sent Echidna in, tried to kill him with the killing edge, missed my first attack, and then Paris gets a 1% crit on me. I cried. Getting revenge for the last attempt, I killed Paris with Milady with a crit from the Killer Lance. After doing that, we were able to pick up the S-ranked legendary Darkness Tome Apocalypse. Next on, we move to the false end of the game, chapter 22. This would be the ending of the game if you didn't go for the true end by getting all the legendary weapons and going through all the guidance chapters. Now this is the battle against King Zephiel in Bern's castle. Your team is divided into 2 groups, each one at the bottom right and left part of the map. In order to reach the boss room where Zephiel is, you need to have a unit hit the switches which are in the top parts of the map. You can either do this by ordering an ally to end their turn above it, or have a mounted unit perform an action over it. We have Kath start on the right side, and then we ferry her over with Juno to the left side of the room to get all the treasure on this map. Now for me this was a very interesting map, because yet again I had another unit that got berserked. This time it was Agreen. Thankfully, as before, she was able to avoid all friendly contact and just focus on enemies. Also, both Lilina and Shauna were kind of out of business for this chapter, because they went to the left to clear up the path for the left switch. Once both switches were hit, you have to make sure that Roy is standing outside of the throne room. The other thing to mention is that at the end of the last chapter, Roy actually promotes into a Great Lord finally, though at this point it's not very important. I open up the throne room, clear out the enemies within, and go on to fight Zephiel. I use Milady with the Malta equipped to kill off Zephiel, finally ending the war with Bern. The war, however, is not completely over, because we still have one last challenge. Finding and defeating Idunn, the true enemy of the game. Chapter 23 is a very long chapter, yet again, but it is not very difficult. It's more of a slog, yet again. There are a few Manicheets scattered here and there, but nothing too bad. This chapter involves us defeating the remnants of Bern's army, who are protecting the entrance to the cave where Idunn is. In this chapter, I use a very similar strategy as I used in chapter 17, which I use Milady and Shauna to deal with the ballistas. I also do a little bit of last minute shopping and get whatever items I need to take on the final area. I bring Fear along for this chapter just so I can recruit all the units, just to say I have. The last unit you can recruit is Carol, who is sitting in the village on the right side of the map. Like many maps before, there are a few Wyvern reinforcements, however they are quickly dispatched by my army, and I make my way onto the boss. I make my way over to the boss of this chapter, Brunya, who is the last remaining Bern general. Now, be careful as you make your way towards the boss, because not only does Brunya have a bolting tome, and she's pretty powerful, there are druids with sleep staffs near her. Now, surprisingly, Brunya has very high defense, so it's actually easier to use a magic unit to defeat her. So I defeat her with Lilina, who by this point is completely OP at level 20. We seize and move on to the last two chapters of the game. Moving on to chapter 24, there are no longer any human opponents. The only things that you're fighting from now on are Manicheets. The other thing to mention is you're forced to bring along Fae, so you can only choose 8 other units. In our case, we only have 2 extra slots for units. My other 2 units that I bring along are Echidna, who has the Armads, and Milady, who has Maltet. It's kind of funny that Shanna is still here, but she's a fairy for Fae, who I don't want to leave alone. Now, the gimmick of this chapter is there are rooms that you go into with Manicheets in them. You defeat the Manicheet, Roy seizes the throne for that room. Then you'll get a plot point with John talking to Roy about the scouring, about why the dragons are here, about basically the questions that Roy has. The other thing to note is that when you complete a room, Manicheets will spawn from behind and continue chasing you down, so you need to be quick about this. Thankfully, I have all of my legendary weapons intact, and I have a Hamern staff in case any of them break, which I do use on Maltet later in the chapter. The main units I use in this chapter are Milady and Sue, because of their movement. I'm able to get them in and one-shot the enemies before they even attack me. Milady does take a bit of damage, but nothing scary, and we were able to move on throughout all of these rooms and finally get to John, the boss. Now, John is just a beefed up Manicheet, so he's really not that difficult. I'm able to use Lilina, who at this point with the 4 blaze equipped does 47 times 2, which completely destroys Jean's 80 HP. After that, we jump into chapter 25, the last chapter of the game, in which we face off against Idunn, or Idunn, however you pronounce her name. Now, the units that you pick last chapter are forced in this chapter. Now, for a final boss, Idunn is not that big of a threat. The map starts off with 2 Manicheets and Idunn at the very back. I pick off the 2 Manicheets, and I send Roy in with the Binding Blade to defeat Idunn and complete the challenge. Now, my final thoughts for this challenge was that ultimately it was not that difficult. I assumed it wouldn't be too bad as I wasn't playing on hard mode. I knew Milady was broken, but I didn't actually realize how broken Lilina was until I played through this game again. As long as you give her some speed increasing items, you're pretty much set, because she could double most things, and she has an insane magic stat. By the end of the game, she'll hit 30 for magic, which is just mind-boggling how strong that is. It did kind of go how I expected it to though. The beginning of the game was really difficult. I had to reset a lot. This being because we didn't have very many units, and those units that we had were kind of okay, like Dorothy and Wendy. As we get further on in the challenge though, it gets easier and easier because we recruit Lilina, Echidna, we got Larm for dancing, and even Sophia put in a decent amount of work, surprisingly. That's the biggest upset, is Sophia actually did help. She was like discount Lilina, but good because she was the only druid that we had, besides from Nime, who I didn't really use too much. All in all, I had a lot of fun doing this challenge, and I would definitely do something similar to this in the future. This is the first time I'm doing anything like this, so let me know what you guys thought of it. If you think there was anything I could have done differently, if you have any other suggestions for me in the future, that would be greatly appreciated. My name has been Meteor Kaiser, and thank you so much for watching this. And as always, peace.